our Lord of Exilion, Protector of the Realm, James Baillie, who's been introducing everyone. But just a little bit more generally, like he's officially kind of our organizer for Coding Medieval Worlds here. He's a historian, doctorate, whose work is mostly focused on the medieval Caucasus region. But he's also, of course, interested in humanities and video games and digital humanities, specifically data modeling and the ways that code and mechanics transmit ideas through games. He's an active developer and adventure and role-playing games, including The Exile Princes, which I think you've been working on as long as I've known you, which is really cool. It's his game, solo developed medieval fantasy adventure game with minimalist graphics based on medieval manuscript art. So I think that makes him perfectly qualified for today's talk. And without further ado, James.
Thank you. Now the important moment of truth for this is, can we get screen shares working correctly? So yes, it always feels weird and arguably somewhat self-indulgent to do a talk at one's own event. But having run 5 of these, I thought it would be interesting to do a talk where I set out a bit of the, why have I gathered you all here today? What are we doing here from my perspective? How do I think about games, and why do I think about them that way? What's this talk going to be about? It's going to be an overview of some of the ways that I look at history in games. Particularly, I wanted to step through some of my own thinking and think about where it comes from, which bits of medievalism I have come across over the years, and then also looking at how that thinking can be put into practice. It's going to be a bit of a random scattergun of thoughts, but hopefully an interesting one. So we're going to start with some kind of groundwork, which is going to be some kind of rather odd self-reflection end of things. Then part 2 of this talk will be analyzing games, and part 3 will be more focused on building games. So we will literally go back to the beginning and do the, once upon a time, games as a small child. Some of the things I think that just poked me towards history and medievalism at the start were, I like maps, I like stories. I also have always had a bit of a brain where if you show me a choice between 2 things, I will try and find out what the third thing was that you weren't showing me. And also, I grew up in a particular setting, a particular landscape. I grew up in the kind of rural east of England, near the Valley Fens region. And so that also gave me a particular kind of grounding and idea of landscape, which we'll come back to later. Somebody, when I was quite little, had the bright idea to give me Civilization 2, and how much of the rest is history. Well, I dug around on my computer and looked for some of the oldest computer files that I possess. And one of the things that I found were these. These are things I wrote when I was about 10. They are essentially tech trees when I was thinking about the fen that I was playing on as a child and what kinds of peoples could live there. Now, what should we conclude from this? 1, I was a strange child. That's not news, but it is something you can conclude. More interestingly, though, even by the time I was 10 years old and had not actually been even playing computer games for that long, I was thinking about some of these things in framework. The games that I was playing, because these I got the idea of tech trees from playing things like Civilization and Total War and so on. And so those thoughts had already got to the point where I was repurposing them to think about other things. And so then we have already, I guess, this sense of interaction between games and how I think about peoples and societies, and also histories, because a tech tree is a type of storytelling. It's a way of saying, this is what a progression looks like. This is the arc that a group of people, a civilization, or something like that goes on. These are not very good examples of that, but it's a starting point. It's interesting to see how that thinking starts emerging. I also was a Tolkien nerd, and this comes in quite early, and so from that, I think you get some of these ideas. Medievalism is this sort of distant, formative, escapist path. Medievalism, I think, differs from more recent bits of historical reception in part because it is so much more heavily tied into the fantastic. Um, because of its distance, we can tell different sorts of stories with it. And we have different sorts of popular historiographies of it. And I think Tolkien is a particularly formative part of that process and how it develops. Um, Partly in that Tolkien is much more directly engaged with the Middle Ages than most later fantasy writers. So he's sort of taking, in some ways, more directly bits of medieval fantasy and storytelling, and also is presenting the Middle Ages in a way that comes out of medieval epic more than medieval chronicle writing. But then modern medievalism, particularly as it transfers into games, starts regularizing this. What is a goblin? Well, we think a goblin is a sneaky little guy and an orc is a big tough guy. Um, Tolkien probably didn't have that particular distinction in mind, but he used the word goblin when he was writing The Hobbit and used the word orc when he was writing The Lord of the Rings. And so the Hobbit vibes transferred onto goblins, and then in D&D that became the sneaky little goblin. The Lord of the Rings vibes transfer onto orcs, and this transfers into the big, tough, more serious creature that you get later. So again, these processes all drive into some of my early encounters with the medieval and medievalism. And I also played Warhammer as a teenager, and Warhammer is both this quintessentially medieval setting and not really that medieval in many other ways. You have this kind of late medieval Arthuriana being thrown in via Bretonia. The Empire is really almost post-medieval. It's got this very late Holy Roman Empire religious wars thing going on. The Chaos Marauders are 8th century Vikings, but then also with Lovecraftian horror and giant late medieval suits of armor. And then you have the Chaos Dwarves if you want some ancient Mesopotamian beard aesthetics in your fantasy games as well. But despite this incredibly eclectic setting, it's often understood as medievalist. Early editions of Warhammer kind of justify how weapon rules work by this is how it worked historically. So what we decide is medieval is clearly not just a function of what is, quote unquote, in that historically accurate. And it's certainly a whole setting doesn't need to be historically accurate for people to appeal to the medievalists for particular elements of what they're writing. And then I got on things like game modding. These are screenshots from the Total War mod for Rome Total War, which was a thing I made. My first game experience were building point and clicks in browsers. I then got into modding games, which I think it's very useful to have hands-on experience when you're writing about and thinking about games. And modding games, I think, is often as good for that as lots of other bits of game design. And I think one of the things it really taught me from an early point is that the feel of a game can change by the way you mod it. When you have a stat block for a character or a unit type, you can significantly change how the game feels to play depending on, for example, do you make the combat fast and brutal? Do you give them low health bars and high damage? Or do you make it slow and make it more about who breaks first on a morale basis and things like that? So this, I think, again, plays back to that idea of structures and data implicitly tell parts of the sorts of stories that we're trying to tell, and therefore the sorts of histories that people will take from this. I made various little text adventure RPGs and online games, which I can natter more about, but we will move on for now. And then in 2008, I founded a small website called Exilion, which I have already mentioned because it co-hosts this event. Exilion grew out of Total War modding communities and to a lesser extent Mount and Blade modding communities, then later developed into a kind of wider creative community, I think, as particularly AAA games really outpaced what modders could produce in terms of graphics for total conversion overhauls. A lot of people who in 2010 would have been trying to make mods end up trying to make small indie games in 2020. I think that shift, I guess, was one of the things that changed what we were doing on Exilion. But also we kept Exilion going all the while that a lot of things were shifting to a much more social media platform. And part of that was because I found the way that we did discussions on Exilion was different to what I could get on social media. And the structure of how we discuss games and how we discuss history is partly driven not just by the actual thing we're discussing, but the spaces that we're discussing it in. And so particularly in social media, I think almost most probably in the middle of the last decade, it was a very one-way interaction for a lot of things. You know, people were using social media much more as a broadcast platform increasingly. And for some of this stuff, I didn't want to be broadcast that. I wanted to have a discussion. So that both drove me keeping that community going, but also helped me think about the structures that we end up using to negotiate through and discuss these sort of games and their relationship to history. And there's a serious element to that. Because as, you know, being in that kind of internet milieu with history and games and so on, you kind of see the mental pipelines that different people go through. And there are people I knew back in 2008 to 2010 who I'm still, you know, close friends with and went down more or less the same kind of sets of discovering things as I did. And there are also people that I, you know, knew from some of those spaces back then who are, you know, unambiguously Umberto Eco definition fascist at this point. Because their interest in history and the way that that interacted with the political world around them pulled their lives in very different directions. And so, you know, I learned in some senses, in some cases, the hard way, that people have very strong emotive attachments and modern political investments in these paths and what they're about. And that discussions about things like accuracy in games are not just discussions about accuracy in games. What people choose to care about as to whether it's accurate will often have ideological leanings to it. And so we end up having to think also about what we want as developers and scholars. And that accuracy is one thing, but also understanding matters. And not all understanding is the same. Not all accuracy is the same. That, you know, having a sword that looks perfect doesn't give you like an accuracy point that you can then spend against having a very different or very inaccurate perception of a particular bit of social interaction, for example. And that it helps to have people who aren't just going, is this right? But also, what does right mean in this case? And how can I, as a player, think about what's going on? And how does that relate to me? So what we want, I think, does matter. But it's also important to say that we should take games seriously, but we should not necessarily take them literally. Gamers do not think games are historical sources. All of the academic work that has been done on history in games is pretty much in agreement on this. If you ask most gamers if they think the game is giving them accurate historical information, they will usually say no. And indeed, they're almost attuned to think that games are less likely to be reliable than other sorts of information. In other words, we can't just look at this by info dumping via games. That's not necessarily the best way to teach via games, but it's also not necessarily the way to fix any issues we have with games. Mishandled and decontextualized information, even if the information is accurate, can be unhelpful. We can't necessarily fix all of this just by making games more and more accurate until we have a perfected representation of the past. And a big part of that is that we can't get a historical person to sit and play our game. You can't fix that. So if you have a perfect representation of the past, but you have a player who doesn't have the mental framework to understand what they're looking at, then you still don't have something that necessarily helps with the understanding of history and why these things are happening, why are these people interacting in this way. A modern person doesn't necessarily start with those frameworks in place. So literalism can end up focusing on the what of history, but why and how matter just as much. And then I took all of this and I got into academic historical career. I started by picking up books about Byzantium in secondhand bookshops. We can reiterate the I was a weird child finding here. But my interest in Byzantium, kind of coming from that sense of, there is a Western European, like knights and castles Middle Ages. There is a sort of Islamic Middle Ages, which is often seen as being contacted by the Crusades. And Byzantium complicates that picture, and that's one of the things that made it immediately interesting to me. And my studies stayed in that sort of orthodox Eastern Christian world because it moves past that sort of simple dividing lines and gives us the idea that there were different sorts of medieval identity, different sorts of medieval reality, and those people mattered too, and the idea that there are different ways to be a certain thing or a certain type of person, I think, are useful for understanding human history and understanding how people work, both now and in the past. And this brought me on to this digital humanities, the area that I am now mostly a specialist in. I particularly work on collecting partial biographical information, putting it into databases, and then using it to assess the social and political history of past eras. That's the study called prosopography. But turning stories into data is very difficult because you start hitting problems like, well, what is a person in this case? Is it a human being that definitely existed, or is it a sort of collected literary idea of that person? We are pretty sure that Alexander the Great existed, but we also have a lot of texts from the Middle Ages, the Alexander romances, that tell us lots of things about Alexander, going off to India and visiting the monstrous peoples of India and the Blemmies and creating enormous mountain gates in the Caucasus and so on and so forth. And that Alexander wasn't a real person. But where are we drawing the precise dividing line? Because all we have is the texts. I think it's Ursula Le Guin once said, "What was and what will be lie in the arms of silence." What we have is here now, and what we have from the Middle Ages is texts and archaeological evidence. So going from that to modeling, okay, what do we think a person was? What was their identity? How did people see that identity? How did they see that identity? Those are reaching through to something that we can't, strictly speaking, get. But we also should try to get it because these are inherent things to how we understand societies as working. So we have to try and tell the best histories that we can. But we're often doing it through these very imperfect representations of people and the worlds they lived in. And that is true whether we're doing it through games or whether we're doing it in academic history. And how we represent people is often useful for telling us what we think about the past. Forcing yourself to systematically go through bits of the past and say, who is this person and why do I think that about them, is a useful, I think, experience. And I think it can often help when writing stories from a game development perspective equally to say, who is this character, but also why do I think the things I think about that character? What is defining this person for me? And what does that mean about the stories I can tell? So to pull some of those initial points together, point one, history is in an ecosystem. It's our kind of inspiration toolbox for building societies, fictional worlds, and games, etc. It also comes, though, with a big bag of player expectations. Once you get into the Middle Ages, there are a bunch of things that people will expect to be there, and we use those as game developers all the time. Once I have set up a castle, I don't then need to explain that there might be knights in the castle. Those are connections that people can and will make themselves just fine. A lot of these expectations, though, are filtered through particular communities, particular societies that people are living in. And they provide a shared language and symbolism through which people can express things that are not just history. People care about history. The perceived attitudes, ideas, accuracy, these all matter. And people are forming historiographical ideas from this. But historical reception is part of wider discussions, and we need to be aware of that because both because of the impacts that our stories might have, but also because of how it lets us tell or not tell particular ideas in games and in the public reception of what we do as historians. Secondly, games are a curation process. Is this accurate? If it is a whole game, no, it is not accurate, because that's not really how games work. They are, in fact, games. Or does this feel authentic to players? It's an interesting question, but we often don't know the answer to it. So my position has always been that the interesting thing to ask is, what is this thing doing here? What have we taken out of the Middle Ages, and why have we done that? And what has been left behind? What is not included in our modern games, and why has that process taken place? This is useful for a bunch of reasons. Firstly, it lets us talk better about things that are not trying to be accurate or authentic, because a lot of our idea of the medieval comes from, as we saw earlier, medieval fiction, not necessarily things that medieval people themselves thought were definitively real. It also empowers us, I think, to talk more about development and processes, when we can say, okay, what process has been done to take these things from the Middle Ages, and why are we using them, and what impact is that having on our games? Third point, coding is a form of storytelling. Data structures create our game world. Processes tell us how that game world acts. Digital historians and game developers both do this process. This is an encoding process of turning information from one structure into another. But also, code layers can make things feel more true than if we made that history explicit. Because it is underlying, it's not something that gets told to the player, it is something that the player just experiences. So there is no mental space created in the game for questioning the code layer. It's part of the field of the world that they're living in. And that shapes a whole bunch of things. How do people act? Is this a world alien to the player or very familiar to them? And is this a violent, a mercantile, a humane world? All of those things can be tweaked in ways that are not very explicitly presented to the player as part of the story, but still make a big difference to what sort of history ends up being told. I'm going to take a moment to move a thing from my desk because it's giving me some sound resonance. Hang on. Okay, sorry about that. Part two. Let's look at some bits of medievalism in games, where and why they are appearing. So thinking about history of the ecosystem, what connections are being made beyond the game? thinking about games of curation, what's here, why, what's left out, and thinking about what the dynamics are that are presented. I'm going to look for it at Return to Moria. It's a survival crafting RPG set in Middle Earth. It's about dwarves returning to Moria in the Fourth Age. This is all wrapped up in Tolkien's particular ideas about Judaism, which are difficult and complicated, to say the least. But Return to Moria very much aimed for a particular thematic closeness to how Tolkien is seeing this. Core game loops of base building, resource gathering, dodge and roll combat. This is what the game looks like. It's really quite pretty. It is sometimes a bit Bethesda janky. Not that it's made by Bethesda, but when I say that, a lot of you will understand what I mean. But it is very pretty and lets you do some nice building. And that building is based on quite square, blocky designs, pointed arches, and columns. There are multiple reasons for that. Some of them are game-based. It is easier to implement a square-by-square design than implementing round structures if you want the player to do a lot of the building. But it also fits with a very medievalist sense of heavy stone architecture being a medieval idea in itself. Though also, some of that squareness is based in this kind of Art Deco dwarf style, which actually really is much more modern. The idea that dwarves have this particular stone angularity to their building really only beds in the sort of 90s to 2000s. It gets very popularized, particularly by Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films. If you look at presentations of dwarf cities in games from the early to mid 1990s, they are actually much more fluid and much less kind of hard lines than the thing that we have all now come to expect. So something can become a medievalism in much more recent periods. There's also a whole bunch about gender that is interesting to say in a game about dwarves. Dwarves are often seen as quintessentially masculine. They are the little beardy guys. But also, because they are all seen as a certain sort of quintessentially masculine, that actually in some ways can make them a bit more complex in terms of how their gender is seen. In Return to Moria, dwarves are not given explicit gender. You can shape the body, voice, etc., which both plays into the kind of canon and popular idea of, oh, well, humans can't tell dwarf men and women apart anyway, but also lets players, if they want to, do a more fluid reading of who their character can be. And I think this is an interesting tension in a lot of medievalist type games. Do we try and represent particular identity dynamics, or do we try and not represent them to give more freedom to a player? If we don't represent a medieval identity dynamic, do we lose some of the kind of experiences and stories that could be based on that? But if we are representing it, then who are we representing it for? Because these are games to be played by players, and generally players do not like being in a position where their character is very significantly hampered in how they experience the world. And also, most importantly, I think, are we doing it in ways that players understand? Do players understand if they are being presented with a particular historical or literary idea of how a society constructs identities or genders? Are they understanding that as something that is interesting and that they should be thinking about and interacting with, or are they just understanding it at, solely in terms of the external to the computer game world and what that means based on that? And I don't think there is any one right answer to this. I think we can and should do multiple of these sorts of things in different games. I think we should make more games that do interesting things with how different sorts of people experience the past. But that doesn't mean that we should take a very blunt reading of the past and put it in every game. We don't need to have it as an either or. But how we answer it and how we think about that in any particular game matters. Another part of Return to Moria is that metals do not work like metals. Your steel is better if it has gold alloyed into it. And whilst I am not a metallurgist, that is not how metal works at all. But it still makes sense to the players. And this is interesting, because it means that the materials are powered by their value rather than their logical properties. A lot of these materials are made up for the game, then, I mean, excepting, obviously, mithril, a lot of them aren't in Tolkien. But this creates a progression based on value that is recognizable to players, and allows them to have a far larger number of different types of metal involved in the game, which is useful for their resource gathering pathway. But this idea, again, this is the sort of juxtaposition between medievalism as reality and medievalism as fantasy, is that you can have this sense of value powering or kind of numinous properties powering things in a fantasy game. But I think you could also put this in a pseudo-historical game, and far fewer players than you might think would bat much of an eyelid, because there is a logical progression to the player of good thing better, which is all that's being played on here. And the final thing I want to say about Return to Moria is looting the dead. You don't actually do it in Return to Moria, and that's interesting to me. Instead, you have a sort of honouring the dead mechanic. It's still, in a sense, an acquisitive mechanic, but the thing you get, you can't exchange it for money. You can use it to build certain more kind of reverent or numinous related building options. There's also a strong use of collective song among both players and NPCs in the game. This is a very Tolkien-y thing, but it also provides an interesting medievalist approach that I've not seen as much in other games, where to try and mechanize the idea that it's not all just about the kind of every man for himself, take what you can and run, even in a survival game, that actually this is a society where there are certain societal norms that your character will participate in. You still get rewarded for that participation, but you can kind of tell much more why the society works that way. I'd be very interested to see more use of some of these sorts of ideas in some other games. I'm also going to talk a little bit about a couple of other case studies, one of them being Mount and Blade, which I mentioned earlier, which I also did a lot of modding of back in the day. This is a very unmagical, quote, realistic fantasy. And it's realistic in some respects and very much not in others. So for those of you who haven't played it, the player starts alone or with a small warband. You start as a mercenary and become a lord. It's very core kind of mounted and first-person combat. There are strategic elements to later games. It's explicitly inspired by things like Bernard Cornwell. It's that kind of slightly gritty medieval war fantasy. Here are some pictures. But one of the things about it is that it also doesn't have a lot of things like, there's practically no religion in the game. Not uncommon in medieval fantasies, but also if we were talking about what's realistic here, then taking the sort of numinous thing that is represented actually quite well, I think, in Return to Moria, and then we have this nominally more, realistic medieval experience, even if it is in a secondary world, that actually strips all of that out and says, no, these are all going to be characters who have a pretty grounded, actually in some ways very modern sense of the world around them and death and what it means, which in a society like Mount and Blade, which is seeing a lot of death all the time, that is a huge shift between the kind of world that the player of Mount and Blade gets and anything that a medieval person might think of as medieval. And it also has interesting things about culture. So in strategy games, land that you take often shifts to the player culture, or you are given incentives to shift it. That's true in Total War and true in Crusader Kings 3. Mount and Blade, interestingly, doesn't do this. Instead, a village or town in the game has a static culture, which means that as you expand into other parts of the map, you can start recruiting different cultural blocks of troops. So we actually have and so this is some of the kind of modeling that can really affect how a player interacts with identity in a game like this. Because in a Total War game, identity is completely flexible. You can change people's identities. In Crusader Kings 3, you can go in and spend 20 odd years in a province, and yes, all the people will, at the end of it, pop out as good little insert your culture here. In Mount and Blade, that doesn't change. You can't change people's culture at all. However, lords in Mount and Blade can switch faction very easily, and do. So it gives a different historiography of culture and how it works, with a mobile elite but very static underlying cultures that are pretty much unchanging over time. Also, in the game, players obviously gain power and land through war, and so this requires almost continuous war to be available, with quite fluid boundaries based on points of control, your cities, your castles. So again, it's a different model, a different experience of war compared to more strategic games. Realism in war is not the same, therefore, as realism in the things that feed into whether a war is happening. And this encodes some particular sorts of ideas of medievalism as a totally warfare-driven period and society, which is a popular perception of the period. And to be clear, I'm not saying this as a critique. I'm not saying they should have got it more accurate, but I think it is worth understanding that interaction between the mechanic needs this. So we've picked out this particular way of presenting medieval warfare, and this encodes these particular ideas that are then fed back towards the players. And for my final mini case study, I'm going to talk quickly about Hades. Hades, quintessentially classical Greek, with its, modern rock soundtrack and modern character takes. But there is a surprising amount of medievalism in the game. Please observe these stained glass windows, a decidedly medieval technology that is somehow turning up in our, quote, ancient Greek Tartarus. Have a look at this outlook over Asphodel in the first game, and that in the top left corner is Bruegel's Tower of Babel, which for some reason has turned up in so this 16th century painting has turned up pretty closely represented in, again, our ancient Greek world. And then we also have this river of fire with lots of grasping hands turning up out of it. And there's a bunch of similar representations throughout this part of the map, and it's all very medieval doom painting. And it's medieval doom painting in Asphodel, which is a meadow. Asphodels are a type of flowers. There is a fun little in-game explanation, which is that the flaming river Phlegethon burst its banks, but fundamentally what we're getting here is a medieval doom painting. This is a very medieval idea of the underworld that forms a level in Hades. Why? Because Hades implies hell to a modern audience. And our vision of hell as modern people is a very medieval one. It does not bear much resemblance to ancient Greek ideas of hell. And so making the game Hades, you kind of had to have the thing that people were expecting. The player expectation needs to be brought in, and in this case, the player expectation is a medievalism. And so it is presented. Also in Hades, it sucks down here. You spend the final level fighting rats in a sewer. And this is another route by which you can get medievalisms in a game. A 1970s trope, I think, the fighting rats in the sewer, very linked to the kind of pathetic aesthetic. Medievalist gaming like Warhammer Fantasy role-playing reacted in that sort of period against some particularly American, more heroic styles of play into the actually, wouldn't it be interesting if you were terrible and everything around you was terrible, and we took this kind of cynical, sarcastic view of the Middle Ages? And that becomes a general gaming trope. The fighting poison rats in a sewer in a way that is played as darkly funny. Because there is nothing heroic about fighting a rat in a sewer. But this medievalism builds itself back into D&D, it particularly builds itself into Warhammer, it becomes a general gaming trope, and so this medievalism and the kind of rat and poison Black Death link becomes part of the language of computer games, and is used as such in Hades. So we've seen games using history in this section for what it relates to and stories it can tell, and then reuse and repurpose these ideas and use or play with the expectations they build. A lot of the historical ideas they're encoding are probably not very intentional on the part of the developers. I do not generally suggest that game developers try and write particular histories in their games. That's not how most game development works. But that doesn't mean they're not writing history in their games, because things like Mount and Blade give particular ideas of what a past looks like. And a lot of the medievalism that we're seeing actually can spring up post-medievally as well, but still connects into players' heads as part of that medieval milieu. Whether it is accurate, quote unquote, or not. So the final part, and I am not doing well on time, but we'll see how this goes. How do we make use of some of this from a development perspective? Thinking about, again, the history of the ecosystem. How can my games make use of wider ideas? What is there in people's heads that I can click into? Games curation. Why am I using this medievalist thing, and what left out things could I add? And coding and storytelling. How do we build mechanics to tell medieval stories? And so let's look at that. I built a game called Fenlander for the Historically Accurate Game Jam in 2022. It is this pre-modern Fenland game with lots of references to East Anglian culture, survival focused, but with particular objectives that we'll see in a moment. This is what the game looks like. I have never claimed to be a good game developer, but I do insist on keeping trying. It's a text-focused adventure game. You wander around, you dig for peat, you attempt to get 20 units of smoked eels to pay your eel rent. This is a genuine medieval thing from Eastern England. People did pay their rent in eels. So the idea of building this core gameplay loop, in this case, I was thinking about that sense of groundedness, thinking about the landscape, which is the landscape I grew up in. But I also wanted to have a survival game that rejected some of the standard tropes of the survival genre, particularly the idea that we're doing medieval survival, so you can build a house on your own and farm the landscape on your own. And that is all American frontier mythos. Like, that's not how... That is the aspect I wanted to focus on, to get people to understand that that is not how a lot of historical societies worked. So I focused on particular tools as a way of connecting to the process. So each day, your character can take a particular tool out to the fen to gather a different thing. Having day-by-day cycles, so you could rebalance and recheck your tasks. And thinking about the key areas, the player home and village, and the fenland. So you have the space that you're operating in, but the player home is also core to the game. I wanted this to be a landscape that you were based in, that you were from as the player. It's almost impossible to win this game if you don't talk to any of the NPCs. You could do it if you were very lucky, but it's very, very hard. And this is part of the point, that even in these medieval, harsh, survivally environments, and the fens were not necessarily an easy place to survive for much of history, but you had to get recipes and supplies from other people. Even if you had a single person household, which would be very unusual, you could not do this all yourself. So learning from people, interacting with people, I thought would be an interesting rebuttal to that sort of frontier survival mythos, and takes a more historically grounded sense of surviving being something that is communal as well. And I also wanted to think about how the player interacts with the landscape. a large part of medievalism, I think, that is interesting to me is this kind of pre-modernism. The conditions that people were in for lots of history where they had a much closer relationship to land and agrarian and pastoralist existences. And I don't want that to sound, misty-eyed. These are often grim environments lived in difficult ways, but it's a very different experience of the whole world to a modern urban environment. And I think that missing bits of how landscape works do change people's views of the Middle Ages, particularly in the kind of, oh, the medieval is grey and gritty and nobody ever saw anything coloured. Well, they saw sunsets. They spent a lot more time around wildlife and plants and things than the average modern person living in a city does. So they had in some cases, a very colourful world, but one that's very different to our own. And so I used little vignette moments in Fenlander to try to highlight some of your characters' interaction, what they were seeing around them. Also thinking about mechanics for making Fenland travel tricky to get the sense of the physical interactions of that environment, even in this very limited, stripped down format. And finally, I will talk for a couple of minutes about the Exile Princes. I wrote this between 2018 and 2024. It's a single-player strategic RPG. You can get it on Steam. It had less concrete design objectives. I originally intended it to be a weekend project. That didn't work out for me. But I wanted to give a sense of medieval ideas of the fantastic. I wanted this colourful imagery based on manuscript images and marginalia. It's got a kind of map domination goal. It's still a secondary world fantasy, but I wanted to play more with medieval ideas of what that fantasy could be in places. This is what the game looks like. So yeah, you have your manuscript map, you tootle around, you can visit the cities. There's a combat system which is quite limited, but so building a solo game, I needed some boundaries, so simple combat, no dialogue trees. So the core loop is about moving around the map, making decisions, and in the late game you can become ruler of a city, and it becomes a bit of a map painting game. Although one where you can gain power through lots of means other than simply conquering everything. A big part of this that I wanted to work with was references. So the different difficulty settings each have a different medieval character representing them. The sandbox setting is John Mandeville, author of the medieval travel book John Mandeville's Travels, which is all made up and nothing particularly bad can happen to the main character if you make everything up anyway. So he got to be the sandbox setting. The roguelike setting, on the other hand, is Flea on a Drum, who is the party rogue from the Chinese Outlaws of the Marsh, which is a very long but fascinatingly interesting piece of medieval Chinese outlaw fiction. This is partly a nod to the people who already know this stuff. People like getting the "I understood that" reference moment, but it's also a starting point for other people's curiosity. I think that can be underestimated. That if you put something in a game and you present it to somebody, and somebody goes, "That's interesting," and I don't know about it, that's a spot for them to go and think more about it. But all of this plays to a kind of metagame culture. But for this to work, of course, people need to be able to access information on all this stuff. And I mean, the reason it doesn't work hugely well in the Exile Princes is that I would have needed a player base 10 times larger to notice some things in there. There are definitely some historical references in that game that, as far as I know, nobody has actually got yet. But having put a lot of them in for a relatively small player base, this is going to happen. Scale was an interesting thing to think about. I went for small warband scale armies because I wanted to play with medieval ideas about the heroic, so I wanted battles on a scale where a hero could win them. In medieval literature, they can sort of cutscene mass enemy deaths. You can just have your hero kill 1,000 people if you're in a text. If you're doing that in actual game mechanics, it can get really slow for the player. So that's an interesting balance between heroism and excess. game heroics, I think, in the modern day are much more about the capability of the hero, whereas medieval heroics are often about showing the virtue of the character. So a concern like, but it would be unreasonable for one person to kill 1,000 enemies, are also, I think, often much more prevalent for modern audiences than we would find in some of the kind of medieval texts I was trying to draw on for this game. I use weekly cycles for time, but I didn't use years. I kind of wanted to, but you get problems if you then have to think about, okay, are my characters going to age? Do I do different summer and winter conditions in the game? But actually, if we take this out, one of the things it lost I would like to get into the game is that I lost some of the rhythms of medieval life. I couldn't model things like festivals, saints' days, calendar events. And so the past becomes much more timeless as a result. So this is definitely one of the this is what I left out moments for the Exile Princes. When I was sorting and curating my idea of the Middle Ages for the game, I decided my path was going to be a timeless one. Got this sort of city and wilderness division, which I will mostly skip over here, though I think it's interesting that in a lot of games there is a very, very sharp urban wilderness distinction. I wanted to have a much more inhabited semi-wilderness where you would meet people doing their job. That felt like I could get some more bits of medieval style storytelling with woodcutters, charcoaliers, etc. I will mostly skip over this, just to say that, yeah, I wanted to find some different ways to reward quests, but actually, again, mostly ended up going back to money because there needs to be some kind of fungible part of the core gameplay loop, so you can occasionally get alternate, a weapon or loyalty as a quest reward, but it was actually quite a difficult one to break out of. And the final one is networks. This was a late addition to this game. All non-player characters in the game can have network sentiments towards each other. So everybody can have an opinion on everybody else, and you can manipulate this via feasts, which has an impact on some of the how you take over cities in certain situations. And this is very much closely based on some of my sort of work, thinking about power through connection. And in medieval world, connection is very personal, and attempts to gamify a non-combat element of political power. But this is not a very good mechanic right now, because there is a big information problem. Trying to learn and remember who thinks what about whom is a huge information dump for the player. It's a very hard mechanic to explain, and I think that very much limited the possibilities for using it in this game. So I could break some of the conventions some of the time, but not all of them all of the time. But rather than trying to be accurate, what I was trying to do here was thinking about a focus or an effect that I wanted, something I wanted the player to understand better on a gut level after playing the game. And there's still a lot to offer with what in the medieval hasn't been brought into modern games, both direct elements but also situations that we can use. There's potential of using new things. There's also difficulties, particularly information problems, which we are not coincidentally having a panel on tomorrow. And game progression can be difficult to sit alongside medieval realities or medieval narratives. And so, what is then the role of historians regarding games and games history? Well, we've seen these ways that coding tells stories. We've seen these ways that we can use all sorts of different medieval elements in a kind of curation process. And we've seen the ways that people can connect medieval games to this sort of much wider external world of their ideas about history. And we can use all of that to make better games. I think we can make more fun, more experiences, more different sorts of stories. And we can do that in part by adding a wider range of human experiences by focusing on those things. And I think it's useful as historians and developers to not just think about critique, but also think about what can we build? What can we do that produces interesting medieval worlds that people can explore? I think that's another thing that I like about getting away from the purely is it accurate way of thinking about games. thinking about what we can take, what we can use, has a productive feel to it. Whereas, is that accurate is often much more about sniping or defending particular ideas in ways that don't always create the same environment. I think we do enrich paths by bringing these extra angles to them. We protect them better in some cases from being simplified and weaponized. But we also, just as importantly, add excitement, humanity, and joy to the medieval worlds we build. And yeah, that is very much why I think coding medieval worlds is a good thing to do. And thank you for all being here as part of it.